Happy Tuesday, mathematicians. Today for math, you're going to need your math notebook, your Envisions practice workbook that has the black and white pages, that's a skinning workbook, and your blue resource folder. You're going to need your glue sticks and your highlighters. Go ahead and open up your blue folder. Remember, don't take this out of your anchor binder, just leave it inside. On the left, go ahead and take out the only teach page you're going to need is the top sheet that says 3-2, and it starts with talking about the vocabulary with the word rounding. The rest of the sheets, go ahead and make sure that are clipped still to the left side. Close your blue folder that's inside of your anchor binder and tuck that in your basket so you have it for later. Then you're going to go ahead to your math notebook and open up to yesterday's first lesson of Unit 3, which is called Multiply Multiples. We were using our knowledge of skip counting and using the new zeros trick in order to be able to produce products using a pattern by counting the zeros to be placed in the products. Today we're going to be moving on to the next page, which is going to be on page 42 and 43. So go ahead, turn to your table of contents. Remember, at any point you can pause the video, get caught up, and then push play when you're ready to join us. So on page 42, today's lesson is going to be working on how to estimate products. We're going to be able to do this with a previous skill we have done, which is on rounding. So 9-22-20. Then turn back to the pages we've labeled. You're going to take your teach page, turn it over, go ahead and make your frame, and then your X, and smooth that down. Make sure you go back over your page number just in case it was glued on top of. And on the right side, we are not placing a second teach page today. We're going to just write the words for our 3 sections. So example, in the middle, write practice, and in the end, you're going to write reflection. On the left, we're going to go ahead and write our title above the teach page. So we're going to write estimate products. That way, when we are moving on to our new lessons and if we need to revisit, we remember what we were focusing on with today's lesson. So estimate products. And just like we have it in the past, when we write the title, we're going to not highlight it. We're going to put a highlighted box around just to let it pop so we can remember what our focus of today's lesson is. We're going to go ahead and start with our teach box. Inside we have our vocabulary that needs to be reminded for us. It's the word rounding, which we've learned in a previous chapter. So when we think of rounding, we're going to put a little note for ourselves before we start that we can also look back at lesson and then on page. Because remember, the whole point of us creating our interactive notebooks is to build ourselves a resource that we can use with understanding what we are supposed to be mastering. So if we go back, we can go back to the rounding numbers lesson, which was on page 26. So go ahead and record that that was on page 26. So if you get stuck, you know there is a lesson specifically on the steps of the rounding process. We also know that this is, the steps come from a song that we should have learned and practiced every time we did the steps of finding a rounded number. So we're going to go ahead and revisit the definition. So rounding is going to be a process that determines which multiple of 10, 100, 1,000, and so on a number is closest to. So we're going to use our steps, and if you need to, remember, if you turn back to page 26, you have the steps to find the place, look next door, 5 or more to raise a score, 4 or less to let it rest, and then look to the right, put zeros in sight. So we're going to use those steps today to help us remember. So we're going to start by looking at the first problem. So it says to round 3,524 to the nearest 1,000. So I'm going to box that word round because that is a key word to solve correctly. So we're going to round and then we're going to lasso or circle the important numbers. So we have the number and I'm going to rewrite it 3,524, and it tells me to do that to the nearest thousand. So that's also going to be an important description. It tells me the exact place to round. So looking at my place values, I find my place by underlining it. I look next door by pointing to it with an arrow, and then we determine if it's 5 or more, it's going to raise the score of the underline, or if it's 4 or less, it's going to let that underline rest. So because it is exactly 5, that fits in the category 5 or more, raise a score, we know that means that it's going to add 1 to the value, and that's going to change to 4. Then the rest of the song tells me, look to the right, zeros in sight. So anything starting at the arrow turns into a 0 for the remaining place values. So the rounded number should be 4,000. So it walks us through the steps that we just completed. So it says, look at the digit to the right of the thousands place. Well, we just did that. We're adding 1 to the digit in the rounding place, and then write 3 zeros. So that is 5 or more, raise a score, and then look to the right, zeros in sight. So we just determined that the number 3,524 rounded to the nearest thousand is the number 4,000. And I'm going to continue put little musical notes all around this example to remind myself that it's very important for us to be able to realize that if we know the steps of the song, that's going to help us with the rounding process. Another important part is going to be the steps over in this box that we're going to highlight just to have as a reminder. So these are some rounding rules, and it tells us if then statement. So it says, if the digit to the right of the rounded number is, and then it says less than 5, these are the things to follow. If that number that we have the arrow pointed to is 5 or greater, these are the steps to follow. So the if is the first step, and then you start with first you'll do, and then you'll finalize it. So because we're going to use this as the steps of the song, I'm going to just point to the find the place, look next door. The look next door is always where we put the arrow. Now moving on to some more examples, we're going to now be able to use our rounding to help us multiply a larger factor. So we have been practicing with our fact families of having a single digit by a single digit. Well, in this chapter, we're going to start multiplying a single digit factor by a multi-digit factor. So in order to understand if an answer is what we consider reasonable, we have to be able to use estimation or rounding to get to a number that's close to the answer. So we're going to use this as the first problem. So estimating the factor 6 times 789. So we're going to round the larger number first. So they've already found the place. They're going to look next door, so I'm going to point to it. 5 or more, raise the score. 4 or less, let it rest. So it's 5 or more, so that means that we're going to raise the score of the 7. We always raise the score by adding 1 to the underlying number. Then look to the right, zeros in sight. The 2 remaining place values are changing to zeros. So our estimated or rounded number for our second factor of 789 is a new number of 800. We then use this estimated number and replace it in our equation. So now we have 6 times 800. Well, we learned a trick yesterday that will help us be able to multiply quickly called the zeros trick. We look at both factors. If they have any zeros on the right side or in the smaller place values that touch the edge, we can go ahead and take those out, directly move them to the product, and then we're left with what we call our basic fact. So then we can use our memorization of basic facts to help us. 6 times 8 would give us the product of 48 that we place in front of those 2 zeros we moved, and then we place our comma between the periods. So 1, 2, 3 places, put the comma, and your estimated product is 4,800. So we're going to give some tips to how to solve a little bit easier. So the first tip is to know which of your 2 factors to round or use estimation with. So we're always going to round the bigger number. we don't need to round a single digit number because we should know how to use a single digit quickly. The multiple digits is a little bit more complex to do. So if we use rounding to initially find an estimated product, that's going to help us solve a little bit quicker. And the second tip for us to remember is to use our zeros trick. So we're going to multiply using the zeros trick. So both of these little tips are going to help us speed up the process of our solving today. Let's move on to the next example, remembering our two tips. So we have the equation or the expression that we're going to solve for, 4 times 6,251. First tip is to round the bigger number. So the 4 is going to stay the same, so I'm going to immediately put the 4 back in the equation. I don't need to do anything to a single digit. The second number, I'm going to use our rounding process for estimating the number. So it says to round 6,251 to the nearest thousand. So typically we round to the largest place. So that tells me when I find my place, I underline it. I look next door and place my arrow. 5 or more, raise the score. 4 or less, let it rest. So the 2 fits in the category of 4 or less, meaning it's going to let the 6 rest or stay the same. So I immediately rewrite the 6 to say it stays the same. And then I look to the right, zeros in sight. So I start at the arrow. There's 1, 2, 3 place values that turn to 0. So I record 1, 2, 3 place values. And because I know it's going to stay in the thousands place, I put my comma to show the correct break in periods. Now I can rewrite the estimated number as my second factor again. Now my second tip we wrote was to multiply using the zeros trick. So once again, we look to see if there's zeros in the factors that are on the right side or in the smaller place values touching the edge. We count 1, 2, 3, move them directly to the product, and then we lasso the basic fact that is left for multiplication. So 4 times 6, if you know your facts, you should know that's 24. And then you place your comma between the thousands place and the hundreds place. Then the next section says you can also use rounding to check if a product is reasonable. So we're going to go ahead and highlight this as another use of rounding. So for this particular one, it gives us an answer to say this could be considered the exact answer, but we're going to use our estimating work, so the work that we've just done, to help us to determine if this sounds like a pretty close answer. So we're going to pretend as if that answer is not there to start. We're going to look at the equation first. So it says to round 3,011 to the nearest thousand. So that tells me that the single factor or single digit factor gets rewritten. The second number is going to be the number we round because it's the bigger number. So if I look at my thousands place, I underline to say I found my place, look next door, 5 or more, raise the score, 4 or less, let it rest. It's 4 or less, so it's going to let the 3 rest. So that means the 3 stays the same. And then I look to the right, zeros in sight. I have 1, 2, 3 places that need to be 0. So 1, 2, 3 places that need to be 0. And I put my comma between the thousands and the hundreds place. Now in order to find my estimated product, I need to use my zeros trick. So I count over how many zeros, place them right in the product, and then I lasso the basic fact that's left over. So 5 times 3 gives me the product of 15. I place in front of the zeros, put my comma to show the correct placement for value. So my estimated product is 15,000. My job is to then look to see, is that original product, 15,055, reasonable, or does it make sense? So I want to remember that reasonable means, does it make sense? So when we say 5 times 3,011 is about 15,000, so that's our estimated product, we can say that 15,055 is close to 15,000, so we consider this answer to be reasonable. It makes sense. Moving on to the right side, we're going to do two problems together where I'm going to have you record the problems and then pause the video to solve, then push play to check your work. So the first problem is number 1, 7 times 486. And the second problem is 5 times 1,240. So we're going to do two different things with our work. The first thing we're going to do is I'm going to give you an answer for each problem. I want you to tell me what is it going to be when you round. So we're going to write the estimated product is, and then tell me whether or not it's reasonable or not reasonable. So we're going to put the two words, reasonable, not reasonable. And the same thing for over here. So estimated product, and I want you to tell me what's the estimated product. And then I want you to circle, is the answer that I gave you originally considered reasonable or not reasonable? Go ahead and pause your video and then you may push play. For the first problem, we need to rewrite our problem with the estimated second product. So the original factor is replaced with the same thing, so we just rewrite it. The second number, we have to remember that we're usually going to round to the largest place value. So this is to the hundredths place, so I underline the hundredths to say I found my place, look next door, 5 or more, raise the score. So when I raise the score of the 4, that turns into a 5, and then look to the right zeros in sight. That means there's 2 zeros that I have to add. When I multiply using the zeros trick, I take the 2 zeros, place them in the answer, and then lasso the basic fact. 7 times 5 gives me 35. Place my comma to say my estimated product is 3,500. Now I want to compare the original product and the estimated product to determine whether or not they're pretty close or they make sense. So when we look at this first number, we can then see, well, this is not that far off. The higher the product or the greater the value of the product, the further the distance between the original and the estimation. So these are still considered to be pretty close values. So we would then say that this is a reasonable product. It's not going to be an exact estimation, but it's going to be pretty close. The second problem, we do the same work. We rewrite the first factor, and we're going to use rounding to find the estimated second factor. So we found our place, and we look next door, 5 or more, raise the score, 4 or less, let it rest. So the 2 is going to let the 1 rest, so I'm going to rewrite it as a 1. Look to the right, zeros in sight. It changes to a 1,000. When I then multiply using the zeros trick, I take all 3 zeros, place them right into the product, and then I lasso the basic fact. 5 times 1 gives me 5. Put the comma to say that my estimated product for this is 5,000. So I rewrite it in that answer line of estimated products. I then want to be able to compare the actual product you were given and the estimated product. For this particular one, there is too great of a value between the two of them. So we would then consider this to be not reasonable. It's too big of a difference. Okay, so when it's pretty close, it's less than 100. Sometimes it might be a little bit more depending on the value of the original. We would still consider this to be reasonable, but this is multiple thousands that are off, so we would consider this to be not reasonable. For your practice problem today, you're going to do the same work that we did in the example, but this time you're going to just submit it when you take your picture. So you're going to solve 9 times 287. You are being given the product of 2,583. I want you to tell me what is the estimated product. So you have to solve using rounding. And then I want you to tell me whether or not The actual answer compared to the estimated answer is considered reasonable or not reasonable. So you're doing the same type of work that we did at the top, but this time you're doing it on your own. And when you're done, I want you to write your reflection that should be 3 to 5 sentences that has capital letters, it has punctuation marks, and you are going over the steps to solving. So think of your first step. You can start with the transitional word of first, then, next, finally. When you're all finished today, remember to take a picture of your completed work in your notebook, and then you have classwork. Today's classwork we said was in your Envisions workbook. That's a skinny workbook that has black and white pages. It is on page 29 and 30. You are doing the even numbers. Make sure that you look through the example again about how to estimate. Then you're going to solve numbers 2, 4, and 6. Remember that when you solve using estimation to find your products, follow our 2 tips from your notebook. Only round the bigger number, not both, and then multiply using your zeros trick once you have a rounded number. Then the last section is number 8, so this is very similar to what we did in our notebook. Turn your page over. You are going to work with your vocabulary on number 10. Number 12, you're going to be practicing some of your number sense. Number 14, and then number 16. Remember to be completing both sides of your pages using the even numbers. Take a picture of both sides to submit. You have 4 pages to submit, the 2 in your notebook and the 2 sides of your workbook today.